For the body is not one member, but many. Being 62 years old now, I look back with a mixture of joy and regret. I regret not having done certain things. I do not regret not having studied more Hebrew. I do not regret not having studied more Greek. I regret having studied nothing about set theory. Because I believe that it's actually the way things go together that is often more important than what the things are themselves. To repeat just a little bit of a story I told once before, my mother came home from church steamed because the rector, their new rector, had said that God is all about relationships. And she was very concerned about this because it sounded like a lot of hippie, I'm okay, you're okay, relationships are everything. But in the long run, God is all about relationships. And I have a couple of stories to relate. When I was 23, maybe, my bishop in British Columbia went to a meeting of Western North American bishops. And afterwards, he wrote me and he told me he found a summer job for me, that I was going to be the summer director of the Ketchikan Seafarers Mission, which is part of the American Episcopal Church in Ketchikan, Alaska. And I would be responsible for running a social center for the summer for fishermen and cannery workers who would come from the lower 48 states up to Alaska to work and make their fortunes in the summer. And I only had to work in the afternoon and the evening. My mornings were mine. And it happens to be the high year of the humpback salmon run. Every 7 years there is a peak year. And as a boy, my happy place is standing on a piece of rock with a fishing rod, casting a lure into the ocean. I've been doing it since I was 5 or 6, and it is the happy place that I have, fishing off the rocks. And standing there at the edge of the rock, you would be looking out at 1 million salmon between 5 and 7 pounds. And if you looked down Tongass Narrows and up Tongass Narrows, you might well be looking at 1 billion fish. And so for this boy to be standing there with a free morning, and a friend who had a smoker who could smoke everything I caught, and the limit was 16 per person. And you would get there at about 5:30 in the morning, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed before anyone else, and you would start casting. But it had not escaped the commercial fishermen that there were 1 billion fish in Tongass Narrows. And so the seine boats would be out there. And a boy would come out on a skiff and hold the edge of the seine net stationary. And the big boat would go around in a big circle and come back to where it was, and then they would pull the seine net in from the bottom and pull up the catch. And I kept thinking of that great arc which encompasses things. So you have this immense batch of fish, and then you have this arc which encompasses things, which draws them in. Ketchikan has a creek that runs through it, and if you walk up that creek 5 or 6 miles, you end up along the trail, you end up with a system of lakes. And as you are walking up that creek, I remember one day, I was walking up on one side. There was a couple walking down the creek on the opposite side. There were the salmon, the big Chinook salmon, coming up the creek, their dark bodies you could see in the water. There were the leaves that were going over the creek. And there was occasionally a raven or a fox or some wild animal. And as you looked at this thing, you took it in. You took it in as a single glimpse. All of these things, all of which have different lives and are going in different places. But at that moment, your glimpse is like that boy's net that goes around a portion of things and draws them in. On one hand, there is something artificial about it, but it is nonetheless a reality. It is that glimpse. If the emperor were going to persuade the Senate in the old days to embark on some military campaign, he would go up with his auger on top of the Capitoline Hill, which is disoriented, that direction. And the auger would have in his hand what's called a litus. And a litus is a staff with a big loop on the top. And the augur would point his litus up against the sky, and he would see what was inside it. And top was good, bottom was bad, left was good, right was bad. And so if lightning, or a flock of birds, or a particular formation of clouds entered his field of view, and if it was top left, it was very, very good. If it was bottom right, it was very, very bad. But these unrelated things formed an opinion in the mind of the augur that the auspices were either good or bad. And so what is the church but a gathering in of people with different trajectories, of different places in life, of different spots on the social and economic ladder, some of them tall, some of them short, some of them particularly brainy, some of them very practical, some of them who someone who can see and simply intuit what the needs are. And God has caused us to come into being. And in this, there are two acts of will. First of all, the will involved in glimpsing. The will involved in gathering. The will involved in putting things together which ordinarily don't go together, but when they are a unity. And that is God's will, to gather us in, wherein we become disattached from what we are normally and become part of a larger unity. That's where the set theory comes in, you see. Because the members of a set are what they are, but they cease to behave exactly as they are, and they become members of a set. They are now part of this, and they change, and they are different. And so it is no mystery that slaves and masters sit side by each in the assembly of the church in the early days, wherein they once were differentiated by status, they now are cheek to jowl. So it is that Jew and Gentile relate to each other. So it is that country people and city people relate to each other. And the second act of will is the act of acquiescence on the part of the members. Paul is describing the church as a body. And he says it has a hand, and it has a foot, and it has a head, and it has all the other portions. And there are portions of that body which normally we are very judicious about, keep hidden and quiet, and yet they are sometimes the most important part of the body. And the hand cannot say, I am a hand in society, and must be treated as if I were a hand in the church, because it is just one part of the set, and therefore functions in line with the whole. And Paul expresses desperately the will of God to create such a thing. But that this is in a letter which is persuasive literature. And Paul is dealing with problems that sometimes have driven churches apart. And Paul is dealing with human emotions which are running strong. And Paul is dealing with a series of outraged justice which sometimes works in, and sometimes subversive activity in the church. That this is persuasive literature on the part of St. Paul means he is appealing to the will of his people, and ultimately to your will, to allow yourself to be placed and to function within a set. The basis of any relationship, a marital relationship, a family relationship, the relationship of a group of fishing pals on a Saturday morning, is based on the subjective subjection of the one to the many, and a rule that the set itself has. Paul appeals to our will to allow ourselves to be integrated into that whole. Because the working of the whole is always an invisible thing. Relationships are invisible, and yet they are everything. The way that something works amongst themselves, amongst its various members, is something that needs to be described, and yet it is a thing. And you and I alone, on our own, have a spot in the midst of some ladder somewhere, but we are nothing unless we are chucked into relationship with others. And so on that same capitoline hill, we see the murmuration of starlings moving back and forth in the sky. And we ask ourselves, how does that happen? How does something that is made up of so many diverse members, each with a will, each with its own brain, each with its own nervous system, move together and move in symmetry? There is something in that relationship that makes the murmuration that no individual starling, cheeky and strong and young as it might be, is able to do. So on Congas Narrows, we see the way the fish escape some larger predator and they move back and forth, and we say there is some aspect to that relationship, to the relationship of the set, which is everything. Paul appeals to our will, to allow the boundaries of our pride, our own self-interest, our own independent existence to be loaned, given, ultimately subjected to God, who would build us into something bigger and better. And to steal another line from a million old sermons, you will not regret at the end of your life that you were not stronger in your own individual integrity. But you will regret that you were not part of something, that you were not plugged into something larger than yourselves, that you had not let those walls tumble a little more. In the name of the Father, and